30 April 1945, 2:17 a.m. Führerbunker, Berlin, Germany. Nearly 50 feet beneath the burning ruins of Berlin, the last heartbeat of the Third Reich struggled to survive inside a maze of concrete tunnels soaked in sweat, fear, and cigarette smoke. Above the bunker, Soviet artillery ripped through the city without mercy, turning entire streets into oceans of fire, while the ground trembled every few seconds like the world itself was collapsing. Inside the underground fortress, Adolf Hitler sat hunched over a wooden table beneath dim electric lights, staring at military maps that no longer meant anything. The empire he once promised would last 1,000 years had been reduced to shattered buildings, starving civilians, and soldiers too exhausted to continue fighting. Every report entering the bunker carried the same message: Berlin was dying. The air inside the Führerbunker had become unbearable. The smell of fuel, damp concrete, blood, and burning paper drifted endlessly through the narrow corridors, while exhausted officers whispered in panic behind steel doors. Telephone lines failed one after another. Entire divisions had vanished from the maps. Soviet forces were now only blocks away from the Reich Chancellery, closing in from every direction like wolves surrounding a wounded animal. Hitler's hands shook violently as he moved across the table, his face pale and hollow beneath the bunker lights. Years of war, paranoia, and isolation had transformed him into something almost unrecognizable. Witnesses later described him as a broken old man wandering through underground hallways, while the sound of artillery echoed above his head like approaching thunder. At 4 a.m., reports confirmed that Soviet troops had crossed defensive lines near the city center. The walls of the bunker vibrated from nearby explosions, sending dust falling from the ceiling onto military documents scattered across the room. Some officers still attempted to discuss counterattacks, but deep inside the bunker, everyone understood the truth. The war was over. Berlin had become a graveyard. Outside, thousands of civilians hid inside destroyed subway tunnels, while fires consumed entire neighborhoods across the capital of Nazi Germany. Smoke covered the city so heavily that sunrise never truly appeared. Hours passed in suffocating tension. Around noon, Hitler emerged briefly from his private room beside Eva Braun, the woman who had chosen to remain inside the bunker despite knowing death was inevitable. Only hours earlier, the two had married in a quiet underground ceremony while Soviet artillery pounded the streets above them. The celebration felt less like a wedding, more like a funeral waiting to happen. Several officers noticed that Hitler barely spoke during his final hours. His eyes wandered constantly toward the floor, as if the weight of the collapsing Reich had finally crushed him completely. His once explosive speeches had been replaced by long stretches of silence, interrupted only by distant explosions. Around him, loyal followers continued pretending victory was still possible, but everyone could hear Soviet artillery getting closer with every passing minute. The bunker's final meals were served shortly after midday. Witnesses recalled that Hitler barely touched his food. He appeared physically exhausted, moving slowly through the bunker with dragging footsteps and shaking hands. For years, he had demanded absolute loyalty from millions. Now, only a handful of terrified officers remained beside him beneath the ruins of Berlin. By the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, the atmosphere inside the bunker had become almost unreal. Some secretaries quietly cried behind closed doors, while military aides burned stacks of classified documents to keep them from falling into Soviet hands. The sound of gunfire above ground was now constant. Soviet troops were fighting street by street, building by building, moving closer to the Reich Chancellery with every passing hour. Inside the bunker, Adolf Hitler finally accepted that everything was ending. There would be no miraculous counterattack. There would be no escape from Berlin. The empire that once terrified Europe was collapsing into dust directly above him.
At approximately 2:30 p.m., Hitler retreated into his private study with Eva Braun. The bunker staff waited nervously outside while the sounds of artillery continued hammering Berlin above them. Minutes later, a gunshot echoed through the underground bunker. The silence afterwards felt heavier than the explosions outside. When bunker personnel entered the room, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were both dead. The man who once commanded millions had ended his life beneath the ruins of his destroyed capital. Outside, Berlin burned as Soviet soldiers closed in around the Reich Chancellery. Within hours, news of Hitler's death began spreading across Europe. For Germany, the nightmare of the Third Reich was finally approaching its end. Deep beneath Berlin, the final chapter of Adolf Hitler's reign ended in darkness, silence, and ruin.